one of the problems that I see regularly with Christians who want to seek to provide answers to people, they want to encourage people to trust in Christ, they want to have good answers to respond to. But many of my fellow believers do not think presuppositionally, and they do not first seek to grasp a balanced, broad-based understanding of what the issues are that they are supposed to be dealing with. So the result is you'll get into a conversation with Jehovah's Witnesses, with Mormons, and you end up literally, in the way my mom used to say, getting run around the gum stump, talking about this thing, then that thing, then that thing, then that thing, and you never go very far into depth on anything. You always seem to be in defensive mode, and you just don't get anywhere. And a lot of people have had that experience so many times, they've just given up. It's like, there is no reason to even try. There's no reason to even try. And what needs to be understood is that when you hear an argument, you have to mentally step back and analyze what is being assumed in the objection that is being made. So often we look at, okay, the argument in regards to the birth narratives is pretty easy. They differ from one another. And anybody who reads them sees that. They're telling different stories, is what we're told. As soon as you hear that, the first thing you should do is you should step back and go, well, you're assuming because Matthew and Luke will later tell many of the same stories in much of the same way. They'll have many of the same parables. That when it comes to the issue of the early part of Jesus' life, you should have the same thing. There should be a lot of overlap, and you should get the same story. So if you've got the flight to Egypt in one gospel, there should be a similar version in the other gospel. The other gospel is not going to just skip that. And the genealogy should be pretty much the same. And so they should sort of track with one another, right? At which point, I just go, if we're thinking presuppositionally and carefully, the question you're going to ask is, why? I mean, the first part of Jesus's life is barely touched upon by any of the Gospels. This is what led to the production of so many of the stories in the Gnostic Gospels, is people wanted to know, what is the sinless Son of God like as a kid? Because we all want to know what that's like. And the Gospel writers have no interest whatsoever in satiating our curiosity about such things. And so when you think about it, we're talking about no greater amount of information from either Matthew or Luke. In fact, if you take out the genealogies, which each have different purposes in each gospel, if you take them out, you have less information about Jesus' birth and his early life than you have about Adam at the beginning of Genesis, or at least about equal. So the writers are not even pretending to give you an exhaustive account of anything. And so the immediate presupposition, which Ehrman makes a number of times. Remember when he says, well, John has Jesus saying he's God, and he's even claiming the name of I am. And it's unthinkable that the other Gospels would not record this. And I go, well, I think it. Why don't you think it? Why is it that John, writing at a later time to a different audience, with the others already in existence, why couldn't John give us information? Or let's put it the other way. Would there not be possible reasons why Matthew, Mark, and Luke did not include that information in their presentations that John does in his? I mean, why do you assume that because it's in this, it has to be in this because it's the intention of everyone to give you an absolutely exhaustive account? It's not. It isn't. So why are you assuming that, well, there's no flight to Egypt in one? So if it doesn't fit in the purpose of the author who is giving you a tremendously short, obviously extremely edited, you don't think that each one of them didn't know other stories they could have included? But giving a tremendously concise, purposefully so, version, they don't get to choose what they're going to say. Well, no, they would have to include it. Why? You can say that loudly. You can increase the volume of your voice. You can gesture and gesticulate, but it doesn't actually provide an argument. Why would either one of the authors have to include any element that the other one includes in focusing upon wise men or anything else? I mean, we're not even going here to even asking the question, is it possible that Luke had access to information, for example, about the Magi, that Matthew did not have because Luke had access seemingly to Mary? Because, I mean, he gives us personal recollections. He specifically says, I interviewed such and such a people. I did research. Is it possible that Luke had access to information that Matthew did not? And vice versa. And vice versa. I mean, if Matthew is one of the 12, he's sitting around listening to Jesus at the fireside, but maybe didn't ever interview Mary. Isn't that going to result in some major differences, especially in, I mean, I really ought to, it'd be pretty easy to do in accordance. I had to go in and count up the number of words or sentences in Matthew and Luke, taking out the genealogies, that are prior to the baptism. Probably a relatively small number. And just sitting back and going, Luke has access to this information, Matthew has access to this information. Matthew is specifically emphasizing communication to the Jewish people. That's why he does what he does with the generations breakdown in his genealogy. He's trying to make a point there. It's a Jewish point that we don't really get, but he's writing to the Jews, so he's going to communicate to them in such a way that they're going to understand that. Luke isn't doing that, so he goes a completely different direction, and so that's why there's differences between the two. But even allowing for the fact they're writing to different audiences, they're then drawing from different sources of information. And I just sit back and go, that's probably going to result in something quite different. And then you might go, oh, but wait, then why are they so similar when they're telling the parables? Because that is the proclamation of the church that is done over and over and over and over again. But it's very clear that it was not the intention of the disciples to cast a bright light upon the infancy of Jesus, because I could suggest reasons for that. There are all sorts of reasons that could very logically and fairly be suggested. But my point is, Ehrman and his ilk don't care about those things. There is a fundamental bias functioning from the start that says, no, we just can't allow for those things. These things need to look the same. And the funny thing is, you can't win for trying. When they look the same, then they're just copying from one another. And then it's not trustworthy because it's just being copied. So it's the old darned if you do, darned if you don't type of a situation that is utilized by so much of modern scholarship. So when you hear an argument, don't go into panic mode. Sit back, listen to it, and ask the fundamental, vitally important question, and that is, what is being assumed? And sometimes, look, sometimes because of things like the level of argumentation. Ehrman's got all these degrees after his name, and he's throwing names in there that I can't really. We get challenged and we get intimidated. Sit back, realize the guy you're talking to puts his pants on one leg at a time, and can have all the degrees after his name in the world. Doesn't mean there aren't biases. Doesn't mean there aren't prejudices. They're there. Got to deal with them. Got to deal with them. Got to recognize them. And so keep that in mind as we look at this material. Just on a fundamental presuppositional basis, the birth narratives are going to be different, and there are perfectly expected reasons why that would be.